of slavery. How social science combats unfree labor in the global economy. Kevin Bales, University of Nottingham.
On the 9th of November 1989, I was in London, working with NGOs involved in Cold War issues.
Thank you so much. As every speaker has said, thank you so much to the wonderful group that has brought all this together. And Madam Minister, your kind words about freedom, I think we're all agreeing with you on these. I want to start off with just a couple of small facts that you need to know about contemporary slavery, about modern slavery, if you're not aware of the breadth of modern slavery. This is a map, a density map of the prevalence of slavery in the countries around the world. We believe in our latest estimates, which are now based on reliable data collection methods that we haven't had in the past, suggest to us there are something just about 46 million people in the world in slavery today. We think that's a conservative estimate, but it's also one that we feel fairly strongly that we have a robust and reliable number. The second thing that I want to share with you is this. There's one thing that's very different about slavery today as opposed to slavery in the past, and that is that there has been a complete collapse in the acquisition cost of bringing someone into slavery. You put it bluntly, there's been a collapse in the price of slaves in the last 30 to 50 years. Why? Because the population explosion, taking us from about 2 billion people on the planet when I was born to something over 7 billion today, has created a great pool. Not all of them are extremely vulnerable, but pools of extremely vulnerable people around the world who are imminently enslavable. And in fact, for the 46 million or so in the world that we believe are in slavery, we believe there are something like 700 to 800 million people who are vulnerable to enslavement around the world. These two young lads that you see were originally enslaved for a cost of around $20 each. In the past, such slaves would have cost the equivalent of thousands of dollars in the past. The slaves today are so inexpensive that they are now disposable inputs into economic processes, not investments. So they're not like investing in factories or tractors or equipment. They are in fact disposable in exactly the way these lads are. So when these two boys who are carrying heavy stones up and down the mountains in Nepal, if one of them trips and falls over, breaks their leg, they simply abandon them. They leave them, they push them into the crevasse, they just lose them because they are treated as perfectly disposable, like plastic cups. You drink from them, you throw them away, you don't think about what you might do with them afterwards. Now those are two key things you should know. About 46 million people in the world in slavery, and this strange but strong truth of the disposability of slaves today. Now, I want to point to the fact that a lot of the work that I've done over the last 20 years has taken me into situations where slavery is being practiced. So here you see families in a quarry in India, and in fact, here you see a slaveholder, a very brave colleague of mine, an Indian, took a picture of a slaveholder and managed to talk him into showing his slaves, his quarry, and so forth. Now, it's shocking enough that we can see slavery so blatantly as a man like this showing off his own slaves. But the other thing about this particular photograph that was very strong for me in opening up a new area of inquiry is that this is not just hereditary slavery under a slave master who supposedly owns this land, but this is in fact taking place, this ripping away of the forest, this ripping away to create a quarry in a protected national forest. There shouldn't be anything there but trees. But in fact, there are criminal slaveholders who are wiping away the trees and taking the stone out as a quarry. Now, it was situations like this that I began to look at around the world. Another protected national forest, this time in Ghana, completely wiped out in gold mining. And another area where slaves were in deep shaft mines, but in national protected areas, national parks. And I began to wonder, what if What if there's not just an anecdote here, that there are people who are used in slavery who are used to destroy the environment, but what if, in fact, it's a pattern? What if, in fact, this isn't just about one more type of criminality, but something that is taking the huge global moral issue of slavery and linking it together with the other great challenge we face, which is climate change? And I begin to focus on that, and for about 7 years pursued that question around the world. So what if, for example, if that was the situation in the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Sundarbans at the bottom of Bangladesh? Now, here's a picture from space of a part of the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site. What's on the right side of the screen is, in fact, a mangrove forest. It's an excruciatingly important mangrove forest. It's the largest carbon sink in Asia. It's the protection of the Bangladeshi villages against tidal waves and tsunamis, because this is the sponge that absorbs the power of those natural events. But you can see that there's something wrong on the left side. The forest isn't there. In fact, something has happened there in what should be an untouched forest area where endangered species are living, which is not supposed to be there. What looks like might be buildings are, in fact, fish drying racks. Criminals have established fish processing camps. They lure children to work in them. They promise their parents a bit of money to support them, but in fact, it's all a lie. They take them away. They disappear into the forest. Their parents don't know what have happened to them at all, and they work them horrifically, as you would expect of slave labor. This is actually, again, a very brave anti-slavery worker who captured a photograph of a slave driver beating children to work faster on the drying racks of this slave fish processing camp. Now, I was able, not that long ago, to sit down with a number of these children who had just escaped. In fact, they'd escaped the night before when I was able to sit down and talk to them about their lives. And I talked to them about how they came into this situation, what their lives are like. One of the things that I talked to them about was what were the physical challenges and health challenges they faced in slavery on this camp. The number one was they all said they had diarrhea all the time, and it was a terrible thing, and they all knew other children who had died of diarrhea. But it was the second thing that I asked them that, I have to say, shocked me. Because I said to them, what was the second most important thing that occurred in terms of a threat to you? And they said, every one of them, that they either had seen or knew another child who had been eaten by a tiger. Now, why eaten by a tiger? Because this is one of the few areas in the world where Bengal tigers are protected. It's their space, they're supposed to be left alone, but when you take away their prey and you put children in the place, the children become the prey. And where does all this go, this fish? It goes into cat food. You can see that cat's looking a little guilty. You can see the shrimp, because also shrimp goes into the Western economies for our lunches. What if in the Amazonian forest? This is a map of the Amazon, not of Brazil, but just of the Amazon. And you can actually see in this map how it's been shifting as slave-based cutting of the Amazonian forest by criminals has been sweeping inward toward the Amazon River. The red dots are actually the slavery case, no, sorry, the cases of murder, and the blue of slavery cases. This has been wonderfully documented. And again, from the sky, we can see cut forest where it shouldn't be cut, uncut forest, and in the middle you'll see little bumps with smoke. Those are in fact a charcoal camp where trees are being cut, burned to make charcoal. Now you think, charcoal? Surely this isn't for barbecues, and it's not. It's actually to feed into the Brazilian steel industry. They don't have natural coke in Brazil for processing iron ore into iron, so they use charcoal instead. It seems like an insane use of trees to make into charcoal for this, but they do. And those feed into car parts that we drive around in. And the result is situations like this in which short-term enslavement of poor workers into the areas of the Amazon where they don't know where they are, worked often to death, or sometimes because the criminal slaveholders fear how they might be exposed by slaves who get free. Like this man, he was shot when they were finished with him, buried in the forest, and several years later, I was out with the team to find the bodies. Now, where does this take us? What happens when you put this all together across the planet? This is, in a sense, the key factoid of the story I want to tell you. If slavery were a country with its 46 million people, and about $150 billion the United Nations estimates is what they make each year from slavery around the world. If slavery were a country, it would have the population of Sudan or the state of California. It would have the GDP of a country, a small, poor country like Angola, or a small, poor country or state like Kansas. But if you ask about the environmental impact, you see that slavery, if it were a country, would be the third largest emitter of CO2 into the atmosphere after China and the United States. Not as large as all of Europe, but as a country, the largest after China and the United States. Now, this is a calculation that I know the nerds would love to go into and how we calculated up all of the different types of deforestation-based carbon emission and so forth, but I've had it checked over and over by others. Now, this is the fact that, in a sense, is the big idea that I'm happy to share, is that, in fact, these two things fit together, but it's not just to make you upset and worried, it's to make you realize that there could be answers to slavery in dealing with climate change and in answers to climate change in dealing with slavery. For example, if you think about how to put these things together and if you can use them to solve each other, things begin to occur that can actually be win-win situations. A second example. When we calculate up from our work across the world of those people who are helping other people to come out of slavery, you take the average amount of money that it costs to bring a person from slavery into freedom. It can be very expensive in a country like Germany. It can be 30,000, 40,000 euros to take a person from slavery to freedom in Germany. But around the world, in places like India, it can be 100 euros. And on average, it's about 500 euros, or $500. Well, you add that up by the 46 million, you come to 23 billion US dollars, and then you say, well, that is what we spend, for example, on submarines in 1 year around the world. It's not an enormous amount of money for a global decision-making. It's too much for any of us as individuals, though I think it's about half of what Bill Gates has in his account. And you can then take things like this and say, what if we were to take the people who have been enslaved to cut the forests and, in fact, employ them to replant the forests they've been illegally forced to cut? If you then calculate up the cost of that replanting, but how much it would yield as a carbon credit, because carbon credits are often based on reforestation, what would that generate? Well, for the amount of forests that have been cut by slaves in the last 5 years or so, it would generate something like 48 billion in carbon credits, if you could sell that many. But you don't even need to sell that many, because the cost, that's already more than we need to pay for the cost of rehabilitation and for the reforestation. So, I'm coming toward the end, and I want to just share this tiny bit of film, because this is in a village that was the village that you saw at the beginning of the talk. The village where they were forced to destroy the forest and quarry in hereditary slavery. That village came to freedom. And one of the very first things that the villagers of that had come to freedom wanted to do was not run to the city or buy fancy things. They wanted to replant the forest. And the organization that I was working with them, they said, how could we do that? And we said, we'll buy trees. We'll buy the trees. Well, in fact, it turned out the World Bank was happy to buy a bunch of trees. And we helped them to have all the trees that they needed to begin to replanting the forest. And I finished the tiny film with this one chap in the jumper, because he's actually the forest ranger who had been bribed by the criminals to turn his back on the fact that they were destroying his forest. And now the women of that village say to him, we'll let you stay, but you're going to protect our forest. Now, I have one last thing for you, which is, this is a great idea of Felix for Falling Walls. You might wonder, what can I do about slavery? There's a little card about to be handed out to each of you with some information on one side about how does slavery look in a place where you might live, and also what you might do about it if you were to find it. Thank you so much.